Hi, Kirsten here. To me, this book talks about how we all feel. No one feels like they're good enough or special in any way, but someone else can look and see a magnificent person. This book is special to me, and I hope you all feel the same. Mail Order Magnificence. Book 43 in Brides of Beckham. Kirsten Osbourne. Chapter 1. Betsy O'Brien stepped out of the church and watched longingly as her sister Darla drove off with her new husband, the buggy they drove in dragging tin cans behind them. Betsy had been in love with Benjamin, Darla's new husband, for as long as she could remember. For a while, she'd been sure he felt the same about her, but he'd been interested in her sister all along. Darla had a sparkling personality, and boys always surrounded her at dances, at recess from school. Everywhere she went, boys surrounded her. It was enough to make Betsy spit, but she wouldn't, because she was too much of a lady for that. All four of Betsy's sisters looked a great deal like Betsy, with the same brown hair, but they all had special things that made them stand out. Her oldest sister, Ruth, was brilliant. Easily the smartest girl in school, she'd gone on to college, where she'd fallen in love with a boy from the men's university in town and married him. Then there was Darla, who had a personality no one could overlook. Betsy was right smack in the middle of the O'Brien sisters, and there was nothing remarkable about her. Then came Sally, who was a tomboy in every sense of the word. She was engaged to a man she'd met while fishing one afternoon. He said he was very impressed by any lady who could put her own worm on a fish hook. Of course, Sally had only agreed to marry him when he'd promised her he would allow her to wear bloomers in public. Mother would never let any of her little ladies run around in bloomers. Last but not least was Shirley. Shirley had been an artist from the first time she'd picked up a pencil. She was known throughout Massachusetts for her paintings. An art collector from Boston had seen one of her paintings on display, and the two had struck up a correspondence, and finally had married. Only one O'Brien sister was left. Betsy. She was the quiet one, who read books in her spare time. The one who didn't have an escort for every dance. The one people overlooked. She stifled tears as her last sister left for her honeymoon. Her mother was beside her and completely oblivious to her pain. "Let's go home, Betsy. Goodness knows you'll be the daughter who will stay at home forever." Betsy heard the words and could think of nothing more horrible than that fate. She wanted to be able to live her own life. Not live with her parents for the rest of her days. As she followed her mother, she noticed Elizabeth and Bernard Tandy there, off to one side. They'd been invited to attend the wedding not so much because they were friends, but because they were affluent. On a whim, she said, "You go on, Mother. I see a friend I haven't spoken with in a while. I'll catch up." "Whatever you want, dear. Don't stay out too late." Mother rarely cared what Betsy did. Why, it seemed as if she'd given up on her middle daughter. Betsy moved across the street to talk to Mrs. Tandy. "Hello," she said tentatively. "I know we've never actually spoken, but I'm Betsy O'Brien." Mrs. Tandy exclaimed. "Are you doing all right?" Betsy was taken aback by the question. "Yes, of course. Why do you ask?" "Well, given that your sister just married the man you thought was the love of your life, it would make perfect sense if you were not all right." Mrs. Tandy handed the baby in her arms to her husband. "Let's walk and talk, Betsy." How do you know?" "I'm a very observant person. It helps in my line of work." "You know what I do, don't you?" Betsy blushed and nodded. "It's why I wanted to talk to you. I had a feeling that was the case. Are you thinking about becoming a mail-order bride?" Mrs. Tandy asked sweetly. After a moment, Betsy gave a firm nod. "I feel as if I've spent my entire life living in the shadow of my sisters. Now that they're gone, my sunburn is going to be atrocious." Mrs. Tandy laughed. "You're very funny." "All right. Do you mind if the man you go to has been married before? Maybe a couple of children are involved? Oh, I would adore that immensely. I've always been extremely fond of children. I've always been too shy to approach a man, and my sisters always caught the attention of all the men, which left me alone. And I'm sure you've no desire to live with your mother forever, Elizabeth said. I do understand that. If you remember, I'm the second eldest of the Miller children. You know, the demon horde? Oh, yes, everyone remembers that. Well, then you know I understand the need to stand on my own 2 feet and not spend your life living with your parents. Do you have someone you think would suit me? I do, actually. If you have time, come home with me, and I'll show you the letter. Mr. Marvin Small, if I remember correctly, and I usually do. The Tandys only lived one street over from Betsy and her parents. Yes, of course. Her mother wouldn't mind if she was out late. She probably wouldn't even notice. When they reached the largest house in all of Beckham, Massachusetts, Mrs. Tandy strode straight down the hall, to the last door on the left. This is my office, and it's where I keep all my correspondence. Please, have a seat. I do hope you have someone in mind who will not care that I'm very shy. Mrs. Tandy nodded. I do. She found the letter she was looking for and handed it to Betsy. Read this, and tell me what you think. Betsy took the letter and read over it quickly. Dear potential bride. My name is Marvin Small, and I'm a widower with 2 children, Cassandra and Tommy, aged 13 and 9 respectively. Cassandra is a sad, shy, withdrawn girl. More than I need a wife, she needs a mother. Someone who will answer her questions and love her as her own. My wife died 3 years ago, and my mother has been living with us since then, but my mother has gone back east to her own life, not enjoying the quiet nights here in Wyoming. I'm a rancher, so there was no way I could follow her, and I wasn't going to allow my only daughter to be that far from me. I'm a decent-looking fellow with a full head of hair and all my own teeth. If you think you could mother 2 children you didn't give birth to and be a good wife to a desperate man, I'd love to have you. Please have the matchmaker wire me when you want to come, and I'll make certain she gets paid, and you have funds to get here. I hope you'll reply quickly, because I truly need your help. Sincerely, Marvin Small. Betsy read the letter once more, a small smile transforming her face into one of beauty. Finally, she nodded. I'd like to marry him. I thought you would. Would you like me to wire him? Mrs. Tandy asked. Yes, please. Will your parents mind if you do this without their permission? Betsy took a deep breath. Mrs. Tandy, I'm 22 years old. I've never had a beau. My mother has given up on me finding a man, and has started to talk to me about growing old with her. Call me Elizabeth. She reached out and covered Betsy's hand with hers. You are a beautiful woman, and any man would be thrilled to have you. It doesn't matter that you're 22 or that you've never had a beau. When you go west, you will find that you will be a wonderful mother to Marvin's daughter. It's a big step, but I believe it's just what you need to come out of your shell. Betsy smiled and nodded. I do believe you're right. I will go and wire him now, and see if we can get you on a train out within the week. Or would you like more time? Monday would suit me well. 2 days is enough time to get all my belongings packed and be on my way. I will make the arrangements. I'll send my husband with a note when we know exactly when you're leaving. Will that work for you? Betsy felt like the weight of the world was suddenly off her shoulders. She could travel far away and be with people who had never met her. Or more importantly, who had never met her sisters. For once, she could just be Betsy and not one of the O'Brien girls. Or someone's sister. It would be glorious. On her walk home, Betsy daydreamed about what it would be like to be so far away from home. She could be her own self and no one would compare her even one iota. Life was going to be wonderful. She could feel it deep down in her bones. When she arrived home, she went into the parlor where her mother was working on some needlework. It was pretty much all her mother did except tell the cooks and maids what to do. "Mother, I need to talk to you about something." "All right," Mother said without even looking up from her embroidery. "I've decided to move west and get married." "That's nice, dear. I'm going to start packing today, and I'll leave on Monday." Betsy hated when her mother didn't pay attention to her when she spoke. "Leave for where?" Mother finally looked up and saw that Betsy was serious. "You don't have anywhere to go." "I just told you. I'm going to Wyoming, and I'm getting married." Mother looked perplexed. "But you don't know anyone in Wyoming. Where could you possibly have met?" "I spoke with Mrs. Tandy after the wedding. She's arranging for me to go west to marry a man named Marvin Small." Betsy felt satisfied by the look of shock on her mother's face. It was about time someone paid attention to her. "But, you can't be a mail-order bride. Our family is wealthy. That's for women who have nothing else in their lives. You have us." "Do I really?" Betsy asked. "Whatever is that supposed to mean?" Betsy sighed. "Nothing. I'm going to my room to pack now. I have not given you permission to go." "I'm not asking for it, Mother. I'm 22 years old, and this is almost the 19th century. If I want to marry, I need not ask your permission." With that, Betsy went to her room and pulled out the trunk she'd gotten when her mother had sent her away to finishing school. She'd felt finished both before and after school. What it was supposed to have done for her was still a mystery. She was half finished packing the trunk before she realized her mother hadn't bothered to follow her. It was for the best, though. She was not going to change her mind. It was less than an hour later when there was a knock on her door. One of the maids handed her a folded sheet of paper. "I'm to tell you it's from Mrs. Tandy." "Thank you, Greta." Greta had always been her favorite of the maids. She treated Betsy as if she was a person in her own right and not just part of the five-headed beast that was the O'Brien sisters. Sitting on her bed, she opened the note and read. "Betsy, Mr. Small would like for you to leave Monday morning. I've taken the liberty of purchasing your fare. You will depart at 10 in the morning. Bernard and I will come and collect you and your things at 9. I look forward to seeing you. Elizabeth." Betsy hugged the note to her chest. It was really happening. She was going west and marrying a stranger and becoming a mother to his children. No one who knew her would understand her excitement, but it was there, and she could feel it in every inch of her body. When everything was packed, it felt as though there had never really been anything there. All of her memories were gone, and they would leave with her. All traces of her existence were in the trunk at her feet. She took a bath and readied herself for bed, thinking all the while about how good it would be to no longer be in Beckham, Massachusetts, a place where she'd never quite fit in. Never quite been good enough. A whole new world was opening up for her, and she was counting down the hours until she could leave. She wasn't even surprised her father hadn't spoken to her about leaving. He didn't care more than her mother did. Oh, they cared about all their girls in their own way. The ones they could be proud of were their favorites. So all but her and her tomboy sister Sally. She read for a while before going to sleep. Little Women had been a favorite of hers for a good long while, and she was rereading it for what seemed like the 30th time. She understood Meg best of all. She certainly wasn't a peacemaker like Beth. Amy was more like her sister, Shirley. Jo was like Sally. Betsy was the nondescript one who no one noticed. That was more like Meg than anyone. And she wanted to be a mother. There were no more aspirations in her world. She had to wonder who Cassandra would be like. It would be good to get to know her. Maybe she would share her love of Little Women. She was a great deal more excited to be a mother than a wife. She wished the train didn't take so terribly long to get across the country. No matter though. She wasn't running from something. She was running to something. Betsy O'Brien, the most boring of all the O'Brien sisters, was running to a family and a fresh start. Soon, she would be there. There would be no more nights all alone with no one to talk to. No more days of sitting and sewing with her mother, with neither of them having anything to say to the other. She took the tablet she kept on a table beside her bed, and wrote how she felt at that moment. For the first time in my memory, I'm full of hope. Hope for my future. For so long, I've lived in the shadow of my sisters, and though I love them all dearly, I need the opportunity to be my own person. No more will I be called that other O'Brien girl, because people can't remember my name. No, I will simply be Betsy Small. Wife and mother. My joy knows no bounds. Chapter 2. The train ride to Wyoming seemed as if it took months. Betsy was thrilled to see the country, though, and she kept busy by making herself a couple of aprons, which she knew she'd need once she reached her destination. She was traveling to Cody, Wyoming, where Marvin was to meet the train and drive her home to his ranch an hour out of Cody. At least that's what Elizabeth had told her as they drove to the train station. She was startled when the conductor called out Cody, Wyoming. She hadn't expected to be so close, but she wasn't about to complain about it. Walking to the front of the train, her legs felt as if they were going to give out. She should have accepted her father's offer of a sleeping car, but she had a feeling she'd be living with no wealth, so there was no reason for her to wait to get used to her new way of life. She accepted the conductor's hand to help her down off the train, her eyes scanning the crowd for someone looking for a stranger. Finally, she spotted a boy and a girl with a wooden sign held between them that read, Betsy O'Brien. She smiled and walked toward them, noting that the girl seemed very withdrawn, as if she'd rather be anywhere else in the world, while the boy seemed excited to meet her. She couldn't see a man near them, so she spoke to the two children. I'm Betsy O'Brien. Nice to meet you, Miss O'Brien, the boy, Tommy, said. It's nice to meet you as well, Tommy. Betsy looked expectantly at Cassandra, who was looking at the ground. Do you prefer to be called Candy or Cassandra? Everyone calls her Candy, but she don't talk much, Tommy told her. Is your pa near? Betsy asked, hoping he hadn't sent his children to fetch her instead of coming himself. A man approached, carrying what looked like her trunk. She smiled at him, a full smile, not the kind of shy smile she was used to sharing with a man. She'd practiced it on the train. Mr. Small? She asked, realizing his name didn't suit him at all. Why, he must be well over 6 feet tall. Miss O'Brien. I see you've met the children. The pastor here in town is waiting to perform our marriage ceremony. I hope that meets your needs. Yes, of course, Betsy said. Thank you for retrieving my trunk for me. My pleasure. Let me put this in the wagon, and then we'll drive to the church. It's only about a mile, and I'd walk it if we didn't have all of your earthly belongings in the back of the wagon. I'll stay with it, Pa. I don't mind, Tommy offered. You'll come to the wedding with the rest of us, Marvin said, shaking his head. You know I want you there. Tommy sighed and acted very put out by the answer. I know. Cassandra still hadn't said a word, and Betsy could see she had her work cut out for her. It wouldn't be easy to get this child to talk to her, and would be even harder to become her friend. She was determined to make it happen though. Once in the wagon, Marvin drove them through Cody, having to stop the wagon for men fighting in the streets more than once. Suddenly, Betsy was glad she wasn't going to have to spend much time in the rough western town. As soon as the wagon stopped, the children got down out of the back, but Betsy waited for Marvin to come around and offer his hand. She gripped it, and he helped her to the ground. I think you'll like Pastor Hoffman. He's not our regular pastor as we go to a small church in the country just a mile or two down the road from the ranch, but he's a nice enough man, and he was willing to perform the ceremony. "I'm sure I'll like him just fine," Betsy said, her eye catching Candy, who was looking only at the ground. Walking into the church, Marvin called out, "Pastor, we're here for our wedding." "Come on then," the pastor called back. The pastor was an older gentleman with gray hair and merry blue eyes. They seemed to dance as he spoke, which was very welcoming in Betsy's opinion. "You must be Betsy," the pastor said. "Yes, I'm Betsy O'Brien." "It's very good to meet you, Betsy. Are you ready to get married?" Betsy nodded. "I'm ready for the whole journey to be over. It takes a very long time to get from Massachusetts to Cody, Wyoming." "I'm sure it does." "Well, I'm glad you're here. And I'm sure this family is as well." The pastor looked at Marvin. "Let's do this." Candy thrust a bouquet of flowers into Betsy's hand, and Betsy smiled at the girl who stood beside her. "Thank you so much." Candy didn't respond. Instead, she looked at the floor, not even willing to make eye contact. The ceremony was quick and painless. Betsy was surprised that in her vows, the pastor asked her to promise to love the children as well as Marvin. That was the easiest promise she'd ever had to make. Already her heart was breaking for Candy. When the pastor told Marvin he could kiss the bride, Marvin smiled down into her face, lifted her chin up, and he kissed her. It wasn't a passionate kiss like she'd heard her sisters talking about, but was more of a soft kiss. Betsy was glad, because it was her first, and she had no idea what she would have done if the kiss had been passionate in the middle of a church. It would have struck her as very strange, especially with the children watching. They headed back out to the wagon, and Marvin helped Betsy inside. "Well, that seemed painless," she said. Marvin chuckled. "Most weddings are painful?" "The last one I attended was," Betsy said honestly, offering no more details than that. Marvin seemed to accept her answer for what it was. "I can't wait to get you home and show you around. The children attend school in the church near us. If the weather is at all bad, they are not to go. There are too many storms that blow up out of nowhere, and I'm not risking my children." "Of course not. There's nothing more precious than your children." "Our children," he said. "I really would like for you to think of them that way. Most decisions about them will be made by you. You will be their primary caretaker. I run a large ranch and have 30 men working for me. I don't have time to be bothered with small decisions." "All right. I'll happily take on their care." The entire way home, he talked about the children, explaining that Cassandra had been afraid of her own shadow since the day her mother had died. "You'll need to help her gain her confidence." Mother tried, but she was unable to make Candy any more confident. Candy knew she was always going to leave, and I don't think Candy could fully trust Mother as a result. "I understand. I will do my very best with her." Betsy hadn't realized quite how bad it was, but she was more than willing to help Candy come out of her shell and be less afraid. "Tommy seems to be handling things fine. He was much younger when Lynn died though." He shook his head. "I would love to take some of Tommy's lack of fear and instill it into Candy, but that's not possible." "Of course. I'm not a miracle worker, but I do adore children, and I'll be happy to do all I can for both of them." "Good. Kirsten will be there to take care of the house and cook all the meals. Really, your only responsibility will be the children. School starts in another month, and Candy gets very agitated before school starts." "And during school? I won't be cooking and cleaning?" Betsy asked. She'd had no idea he had someone who did the housework. "No, you won't. Kirsten handles all that." "Does that bother you?" Marvin asked. "No, of course not. I grew up with servants, but I didn't expect to have them here. I think it'll be good for me though. I would like you to sew for the children, if you don't mind. Try and teach Candy what she needs to know to be a wife." She doesn't have a boy in mind, does she? He laughed. No. At her age, if she did, I'd have to throttle the boy. Betsy smiled at that. Her father had been the same when she and her sisters were small. I don't blame you. Tell me a little about you. Were you an only child? He asked. No, I was the third of 5 daughters. I grew up in Beckham, Massachusetts, and my family and I spent every summer living in a house on the ocean. Father would come and join us on the weekends, but he'd travel back to town every Monday. What does your father do? He's a businessman. He owns a few stores in Beckham and some in Boston as well. Well, that's interesting. Did you ever help him with his business? Marvin asked. I wish he'd have allowed that. Instead, I spent all my time learning needlepoint. Mother sent me away to finishing school when I was 16 because she was afraid I was too quiet to ever marry. I certainly understand how Candy feels. Finishing school must have helped you a great deal then. You don't seem at all shy to me. Betsy smiled at his words. Not particularly. I didn't like it there, and I would never recommend sending any girl there. I am working on the shyness is all I can say. And of course her sisters weren't there to make her feel inadequate. That made a big difference. Well, I hope you can teach my Candy to do the same. She's a smart girl, and she always had friends surrounding her. After her mother died, I think she was simply afraid that everyone else in her life would leave too, and so she's formed a little shell around herself that she prefers to never emerge from. My heart breaks for her. Perhaps I can help her. Betsy took a deep breath. How does she do at school? Does she have friends now? No, and she hates every minute of it. Every morning she gets up and begs me not to make her go. I wish I felt like she could stay home, but I want her to be educated. Marvin shook his head. I just don't know what to do any longer. How would you feel if we gave her the option of me teaching her at home? Every school uses the same textbooks. I have mine from when I was a girl, and I was a good student. Not as good as her eldest sister, but good. Betsy was at the top of her class without scaring people with how smart she was. That may be a good idea. At least until she can work through some of her issues. I so worry that she'll want to spend the rest of her life locked in her room and never interacting with anyone. It would be a shame. I'll talk to her about me tutoring her tomorrow. If she likes the idea, she can calm down about school, because I'll be there for her. When did your mother leave to go back east? When school was out in June. I wanted her to stay through the summer, but she said she'd spent enough time here helping, and she needed to get back to her own life. Which is understandable, Betsy said. It had to be hard for her not to be home. I guess. I know it would be hard for my mother. She has friends she has tea with on different days of the week. There are meetings she attends. I don't know what all she did. Marvin frowned. What about your sisters? What did they do? All of my sisters are married. They spent time with their future husbands and worked on whatever project was in their mind. Then they married and moved away, and I don't know what they do all day now. I see. Well, I'm glad you didn't marry young, so you could come and help with my family. Our marriage, will we share a room? It was hard for Betsy to ask the question, but she did better when she knew what was expected of her. Yes, we will. I know ours is an unorthodox kind of marriage, but I still expect you to, well, some women call them wifely duties. Betsy swallowed hard. She understood that men needed certain things from their wives, and though she had come mostly to be a mother to his children, it certainly wouldn't kill her to allow him to take care of his needs. She'd heard her sisters whispering about liking what they did with their husbands when mother wasn't listening. All right. All right? You're not going to argue with me? Marvin looked at her with a grin. No. I rarely argue. I just proceed to show people that I'm right. It's much simpler that way. He laughed at that. Now I understand what I'm getting into here. How did your parents feel about you coming west to marry a stranger? Mother thought I'd lost my mind and told me I couldn't come, but I told her I was, and I did. It's nice to see a woman who knows her own mind. I think I made the right choice of brides. Were there other women who you were thinking of marrying? Betsy asked. There were a couple of local women who set their cap for me, but they weren't the right person to help my Candy. So I made it clear I wasn't interested, and I wrote to a matchmaker, who I went to and asked to find me a husband. Why did you do that? He asked. She shrugged. I didn't have a real identity back east. My sisters were all well, just more than me. People would look at me and know I was the other O'Brien girl. No one remembered my name or anything about me. All of my sisters and I had the same coloring, so we were always compared to one another. You will definitely have your own identity here. He shook his head. I think people thought too little of you back east. I got my first look at you and thought you were magnificent. Your beauty, the way you carry yourself. You are exactly the wife I need. My magnificent bride. Thank you, Betsy said softly. She certainly hoped he still felt the same way when he got to know her better. Chapter 3. When they pulled up in front of a huge house, Betsy was stunned for a moment. She'd thought she was going from a life of affluence to a life of poverty, but it seemed she had married a man just as wealthy, if not wealthier, than her father. Marvin helped her down from the wagon before enlisting Tommy to help him carry the trunk inside. Betsy turned to Candy. Perhaps you could show me around? Candy nodded, but her eyes didn't lift from the floor. She led Betsy inside, where there was a closet and a hall. Leading Betsy down the hall, she pointed to a parlor. What a lovely parlor. Candy kept walking. At the end of the hall in one direction was the kitchen, and in the other direction was the dining room. The house was much more casual than her parents', and it felt like a place Betsy could call a home. Is there a cellar? Betsy asked. Candy nodded. Betsy hoped the girl would speak to her soon, but she was starting to realize Candy was a lot worse off than she'd imagined from the letter Marvin had sent. There was a room off of the kitchen, and Betsy walked toward it. Which room is this? There, a question that couldn't be answered with yes or no. Candy didn't look at her as she mumbled her answer. Kirsten's room. And Kirsten is the housekeeper? Betsy confirmed, trying not to clap her hands that the girl had actually spoken to her. Candy nodded. All right. It was afternoon, and the house was spotless. Perhaps Kirsten took a few hours off in the middle of the day. Candy started up the stairs, and Betsy was behind her. The first door was a bedroom. When Candy opened the door, she saw it was obviously Marvin's bedroom, the bedroom she would share with her new husband. There was an empty room next, and then on the left, Candy's room, and on the right, Tommy's room. At the very end of the hall was the bathroom. I was hoping there would be indoor plumbing here, Betsy exclaimed. Candy smiled slightly for the first time since they'd entered the house. Your pa and I talked on the way here. How would you feel about me teaching you at home this year? Or you could go to school. We're leaving the choice completely up to you. Candy looked at her for a moment, and once she ascertained that Betsy wasn't joking, she said, Oh, yes. Please teach me at home. Then that's what I'll do. Your brother will still go to school every day, and if you decide you want to do the same, that would be fine. It wouldn't hurt my feelings at all. Candy's face looked more relaxed after that, though she still wasn't at all chatty. She answered questions directed to her and no others. When she got downstairs, she asked, When does school start? She didn't see Marvin anywhere, so she turned to Tommy for her answer. September 2nd. Counting the days in her head, she knew that it was August 23rd. So they had 9 days or so. That gives me 2 weeks to get you ready. Do you need new shoes? New clothes? Tommy shook his head. No. I just got last year's clothes broken and good. I am going to look through your clothes and see if I agree with you. Tommy groaned. I should have known you'd act just like a mother. With that, he turned and headed outside. Be home in time for supper. Betsy called after him. At the mention of food, Betsy realized she hadn't eaten since supper the night before, and she was hungry. She went into the kitchen, aware that Candy was following immediately behind her. I'm hungry, Betsy told her shadow. She looked in the icebox in the corner of the room and found a piece of cheese. There was what looked to be day-old bread on the counter. The cook we had growing up taught me to make a delicious sandwich from bread, butter, and cheese. It's a hot sandwich. Would you like to try one? Candy nodded. Betsy rummaged around for a frying pan and found the butter. She put the pan on the stove and added just a little of the ball of butter, and then she buttered 4 slices of bread. The butter was sizzling as she cut the cheddar cheese into slices, put 2 slices of bread, butter down, onto the pan. She arranged the cheese on each slice, and then added another piece to the top of each sandwich, with the butter side up. This is the yummiest sandwich in the whole world, Betsy said as she flipped the sandwiches, and they sizzled against the pan. When she took them off the stove, she put them on 2 small plates, and they sat down at the table right there in the kitchen to eat them. Betsy sighed as she ate her first bite. It tasted just like Jacqueline, the cook's, did. Candy looked at the sandwich skeptically, before picking it up and taking a bite. A smile crossed her face as she took another. Delicious, aren't they? Candy nodded. I won't always cook at odd times, but I realized I hadn't eaten since last night, and I was hungry. As they ate, Betsy talked to the girl, trying to put her at ease. When I was a girl, and I would get overwhelmed by my 4 sisters, I would hide in the kitchen. Finally, our cook decided to teach me to cook, because of the sheer amount of time I was spending in the kitchen. I'm glad I know how to make simple meals now though. If I get hungry in the middle of the night, I can sneak down to the kitchen and make myself something to eat. Candy nodded. You can teach me. Do you want to learn to cook? Already Candy seemed a great deal more relaxed, knowing she didn't have to go to school. Candy nodded. What about sewing? Needlepoint? Cleaning? All the things that would make you a good wife. Candy nodded again. Grandmother said it was beneath me to learn all those things. Well, that's not true at all. Betsy shook her head. What if you decide to go hiking and get lost in the woods? You need to know how to both find food and cook it. How else will you survive? Candy grinned, shrugging. Well, I'll teach you anything you need to know. We'll do your schoolwork, and we'll add in anything else you want to learn. If I don't know how to do something, I'm sure Kirsten will teach us both. Candy's eyes widened, and she shook her head. Why not? Betsy felt like it was the easiest solution. Kirsten only speaks Norwegian. Betsy blinked a few times. How will I instruct her on what I want her to fix for supper? Candy shrugged. Kirsten cooks what she wants to cook. I hate lutefisk. Well, we'll work on teaching her some English then. How long has she worked for your family? Since before Ma died. I know you miss your Ma. And I know I would be a poor substitute for her, so I don't even want you to call me Ma. Calling me Betsy will work out so much better. You really don't mind? Betsy shook her head. I think it's for the best. If you ever want to call me Ma, you may, but we'll start out with my given name. Thank you, Candy said softly. Oh, I think we're going to be fast friends. I hope so. Kirsten came out of her room then, glaring at Betsy and shaking her finger at the plates in front of them. She took the plates into the kitchen, though there were a couple of bites left on Candy's plate. Betsy looked at Candy with wide eyes. Is she always like that? Betsy asked in a whisper. She didn't know why she whispered since Kirsten couldn't speak English, but it felt best to whisper when talking about someone who could hear. Candy nodded. Then we should go sit in the parlor, and we'll talk about what we want to do for school this year. Betsy got up and walked toward the parlor, having no doubt Candy was following along behind her. When they reached the parlor, they took seats beside each other on the sofa. Tell me what you'd like to learn. If I can teach it, I will. The first thing Candy did was point to a beautiful piano in one corner of the room. My ma was teaching me to play before she died. I loved it. Can you teach me? Betsy nodded. I took piano lessons from the time I was 4 until last year. I love the piano. Candy looked excited. What else do you want to learn? Cooking, sewing, how to act like a lady when you're courted by a boy. Do you have a particular boy in mind? Betsy asked. I do. Well, you need to know right now that I don't think young girls should marry. I think the youngest would be around 18, but I also think it's better to wait a little while. Candy nodded. I need to learn how to let a boy know I'm interested. I think I can teach you that. They spent the rest of the afternoon simply chatting, and though she thought about pulling out needlework to show Candy how to embroider, she decided against it. Instead, she gave Candy her full attention and the girl opened up to her. Not completely. But so much more than Betsy had expected on their first day together. Shortly before 6, Tommy came barreling into the house. Did I miss supper? Betsy shook her head. Not unless we both missed it as well. Marvin wandered into the house a few minutes later. He didn't seem to have Tommy's need to get everywhere immediately. I'll wash my hands and be ready for supper. He didn't ask what they were having, probably because he knew no one knew except Kirsten. When they all gathered for supper, Kirsten didn't eat with the family. Betsy made it clear she was welcome, but Kirsten shook her head and went back into the kitchen. Betsy looked at the food in front of her and decided not to ask what it was. Instead, she was going to enjoy every bite. After the first bite, she realized it was chicken in some sort of sauce with a baked potato. It was delicious, and she saw everyone else eating the meal happily. Candy and I have been talking. She wants to learn at home with me as her tutor, like we talked about, Betsy said. Marvin nodded. I think that's a very good idea. But I still have to go to school? Tommy asked. Marvin looked at his son. Yes, you will go to school. You don't want to stay home with a bunch of women, do you? Tommy looked between his sister and his new stepmother, shaking his head. No, I like recess too much. Betsy laughed, and she noticed Candy's lips curving into a grin as well. Candy wants to learn all of the wifely arts as well, Betsy said. She'll learn to cook, sew, and play the piano, as well as clean house. Marvin nodded. I think that's a good idea. My mother didn't think Candy should learn those things, because they were below her station, whatever that means. But if my daughter is to someday be a good wife, then she needs to know those things. Candy nodded, her face lighting up that her father liked their plan. Thank you, Papa. Betsy was thrilled with how Candy seemed to already be coming out of her shell a little, and she could see Marvin felt the same. This is why he'd wanted her to come be his wife, and she was glad she'd made the right choice to come there. If every day was as good as that one had been, she would be very happy with her life in Wyoming. Just as they were finishing up their meal, Kirsten carried in a cake that had been iced with flowers all over it. Wedding cake, Kirsten said in a heavily accented voice as she went back into the kitchen. It's beautiful. Betsy exclaimed. I thought you might like to have something special on your wedding day, Marvin said, half a smile on his face. Oh, yes. It's wonderful. Candy looked at the cake and then looked at Betsy. I need to learn to decorate a cake that way. Betsy shook her head. I have no idea how to do that. Perhaps we can get Kirsten to teach us if we tell her what we need. Even if she does understand what we want, she'll pretend not to, Candy predicted. Why is she so difficult? Betsy asked. My wife knew enough Norwegian that she could speak with Kirsten. Since she passed, Kirsten does whatever she wants, and we have no idea what to do about it. Marvin shrugged. She cooks, cleans, and takes care of us. I count myself blessed to have her. And with those words, Betsy knew she didn't have the authority to fire Kirsten or upset her. She'd make it work. After supper, the four of them retired into the parlor. Tommy and Marvin played a game of checkers while Betsy had Candy play a few chords and do a few warm-ups on the piano. She needed to gauge the girl's skill so she could see where to pick up her lessons. Sitting with her on the piano bench, Betsy felt close to her new stepdaughter. If they could get closer, perhaps she would be able to get Candy to where she could talk in public and return to school. She wanted Candy to be able to live a normal life with church socials, courting, and marriage. That was her goal. When Candy began a familiar tune, Betsy matched her by playing the same one, just 2 octaves lower. When they finished, both of them laughing, Betsy saw a flash of surprise on Marvin's face. Finally, it was after 9, and Marvin stood. I think it's time for all of us to go to bed, he said. Tommy groaned. It's early. It's not, and you know it. Bed. He pointed in the direction of the stairs, and Tommy went reluctantly. You too, Candy. Candy stood up from the piano bench and nodded. Good night, Pa. Good night, Betsy. Betsy smiled as the girl hurried toward the stairs to do as she was told. Marv stood beside her, dumbstruck. How did you accomplish so much in one day? I let her know that I understand her feelings and fears are real. And I told her I'd do anything to help her get past them. Well, it certainly worked. Thank you. He reached out and drew her to him, kissing the top of her head. You really are exactly what this family needed, my magnificent bride. Chapter 4. Betsy was nervous as she followed Marvin up to their bedroom. She had thought he'd give her a little time to prepare for bed, but if not, she could use the bathroom. She was so thankful she didn't have to give up the sheer luxury of indoor plumbing. Once in their bedroom, Marvin looked at her expectantly. Do you want to take a bath before bed? Betsy thought about it for a moment. Honestly, I think I'd fall asleep in the bath. I need sleep more than anything. I slept sitting up the entire way here, and a real bed sounds absolutely divine. He frowned for a moment. We'll put off our wedding night then. I hadn't even considered how tired you must be. I'm sorry. She shook her head. No, it's fine. It just hit me in the last hour or so. I'm glad I got a good start with Candy. Truly, that was your top priority. Go and wash up for bed. And you should take a bath in the morning. Betsy immediately wondered if she smelled bad, but she didn't ask. She didn't want to know if the answer was yes. I'll do that. A bath sounds wonderful, but sleep sounds even better. She knelt on the floor in front of her trunk and pulled her nightgown from it before walking down the hall to the bathroom. The tub looked bigger than any she'd ever seen, and she longed to take the time for a nice long soak, but she really didn't think she could stay awake. She'd take her bath in the morning. Betsy did a quick sponge bath before pulling her nightgown over her head and buttoning the top 3 buttons. Usually she only buttoned the top 2, but she wasn't usually sleeping with a man she barely knew. She crept back down the hall, saying a silent prayer that Marvin would either be in bed with the lights off, or he would have gone off to give her privacy. Instead, he was sitting up in bed, the covers going to his waist, and he was watching her. She turned down the lamp on her way to the bed and climbed in beside him. It felt very strange to climb into a bed another was already in. She had never slept with another person, and she was unsure of the protocol. I've never slept with anyone before. Let me know if I do something I shouldn't. Marvin looked over at his wife, barely visible by the light of the moon. You're sharing a bed with your husband. You may do anything you wish. I could take your pillows? Betsy didn't know where she found the courage, but she pulled the pillow out from behind his head and put it with her own, sighing happily. Ah. This is perfect. Marvin stared down at her in disbelief for a moment before he began to laugh. I really think I'm going to like you. Good, because even if you don't, you're stuck with me. We exchanged vows and promised to stay together until death do us part. She was trying not to laugh as she teased him. Who would have thought she could tease? Well, since you've stolen my pillow, you'll have to share with me. He moved down in the bed beside her, his head landing right next to hers on the pillow. He was facing her, and she was facing him. How strange it felt to be so close to a man. I don't think I said I'd share my pillows, she said, unable to keep the grin from her face. He leaned toward her and kissed her softly. I think I like sharing a pillow with you. She hid a yawn behind her hand, not wanting to yawn in his face. Just get ready for some serious snoring then. He chuckled. Now, I know I like you. We're keeping you, and that's all there is to it. She giggled. You have no choice. But you may keep me because I think I like it here. He kissed her once more, this time his mouth opened against hers, and he touched the tip of his tongue to her lip. I look forward to tomorrow night, he said, stroking her hair away from her face. He was glad she didn't wear it in a braid for bed. He certainly understood why women did, but he didn't have to like it. Good night, Betsy. Good night, Marvin. She closed her eyes, expecting him to move back to his side of the bed, but instead, he put his arm around her and kept his head right where it was. She felt very loved, something she couldn't say she'd ever felt before. Asterisk. Betsy woke before dawn the following morning, as was her habit. When she opened her eyes, she realized that Marvin's head was still on the pillows they'd shared. She couldn't believe he hadn't just taken his pillow back, but instead, he'd slept close to her, and she'd loved it. She eased herself out of bed, realizing that the house was quiet. Slipping down the hall to the bathroom, she started her bath, planning to take a quick one, as she knew the rest of the family would be waking shortly and need to use the facilities. She washed her hair and every inch of her body, thrilled to have the opportunity to do so. There had been places to pay for a bath along the way, but she hadn't had the courage to try one. She had no idea what kind of establishments they were after all. After her bath, she brushed her hair and teeth, going into their bedroom and putting her hair up into a bun. She preferred to wear her hair down, but while in town the day before, she hadn't seen a single woman wearing her hair down, and she knew she must conform. She quickly dressed in a simple day dress and descended the stairs to find the children sitting at the table, and no sign of Marvin. Where's your father? She asked. He's doing the morning chores. Milking the cow and gathering eggs. Lots of days he has us do it, but he said we should wait for you. Well, I'm glad you did. She sat down with the children, noting that all of them sat in the same seats as they had the night before. Perhaps the children were assigned seats, but they could also just be creatures of habit. Should I make breakfast? Just as she asked, Kirsten came into the room with a bowl of eggs and a plate of bacon. Coffee? She asked Betsy in her heavily accented voice. Yes, please, Betsy replied. Kirsten nodded and left, returning with buttered toast and a cup of coffee. A moment later, she came back with another cup of coffee and a small pitcher of milk and a bowl of sugar. Betsy added both to her coffee, noting that the children weren't reaching for food yet. Did you both sleep well? Candy nodded, but Tommy had no problem answering. Yup. I always sleep well. Pa says it's because I play so hard, I'm asleep before my head hits the pillow. Betsy laughed. He's probably right. The door opened and Betsy heard Marvin's heavy footsteps as he trod down the hall, presumably with the milk and eggs. When he came into the dining room, he was empty-handed and took his seat at the head of the table. After a quick prayer of thanks, they all served themselves their breakfast. "Does Kirsten always cook breakfast?" Betsy asked. Marvin nodded. "She takes half a day off every Saturday, but she makes our meal before she goes." "I can take over some of the cooking if she'd like," Betsy offered. "It would help me teach Candy to cook." "That's not a bad idea. Maybe the two of you could cook supper on Saturday evenings." "But I have no idea how we'd tell Kirsten that. Her English is lacking." "Is there anyone in your congregation fluent in both languages?" she asked. "I think Mrs. Hansen speaks Norwegian, doesn't she?" Candy nodded. "Ma used to talk to her in Norwegian." "There you have it," Marvin said. "Candy can introduce you on Sunday." "Does Kirsten go to church with you?" "She does. There's no Norwegian church, so she sits in the back with her Norwegian Bible and pretty much keeps to herself. I'll ask Mrs. Hansen to speak with her then. I'm excited to learn to cook." Candy looked very pleased. "And to not have to go to school," Tommy said, glaring at his sister. "You're going to school, and that's the last complaint I'll hear about it," Marvin said. Tommy nodded. "All right. I want you to work with me today," Marvin said. "I need to work on fences, and I figured you could learn to fix a fence. You'll need to be able to use your hands to fix and build things." "Yes, Pa." Tommy looked annoyed, but Betsy had a feeling he was being asked to help out with the fences so that Candy and Betsy could have time together. After breakfast, Marvin kissed Betsy goodbye. "Be good today." Betsy laughed. "I'm good every day." Tommy followed his father outside, but Betsy could see he was dragging his feet. She thought it was a good idea for Tommy to learn from his father, though. Betsy looked at Candy. "Do the men come home for lunch?" Candy shook her head. "No, they eat at the chuck wagon with the other men." "All right. Well, what should we do today?" Candy shrugged. "I don't know. Well, do you know of any good apple trees or berry patches? Wouldn't it be fun to walk around picking some fruit? You could show me around, and we could pick fruit for a pie." Candy smiled and nodded. "I know where we can get blackberries, blueberries, and raspberries." "Oh, those are all wonderful in pies and jams. Are there 3 baskets?" "Yes, I'll go get them." While Candy was finding the baskets, Betsy cleared off the table, carrying the empty dishes into the kitchen. Kirsten shook her head at her as she brought them in. "No." Betsy wanted to laugh. The housekeeper was telling her what she couldn't do. Candy and Betsy set off when she came down with the baskets. As soon as they stepped outside, Betsy shivered a bit from the chill. She'd expected the same hot weather they'd had the day before, but it was downright chilly. "Why is it so cold?" Candy smiled. "It's always like that here. Cold at night and in the morning and hot during the day. Well, in the summer it's like that. In the winter, it's cold all the time. I didn't realize it would be cold. In Massachusetts, if it's cold, it's cold. If it's hot, it's hot. There aren't big temperature fluctuations between different times of day. This is all I've ever known. But I love it here. I can understand why. You look out the window and see mountains. It's so beautiful. To me, mountains are normal. I can't imagine living somewhere without them." Candy held a basket in each hand and swung them at her sides. Betsy smiled, watching her. "I can definitely get used to being here." "Do you love my pa?" Candy asked, seemingly out of nowhere. Betsy thought carefully about how to answer the question. "I can't say that I do. I just met him yesterday. I think he's very handsome and charming, and I believe I will fall in love with him quickly, but I don't love him yet." "All right. I hope you do love him, because I want you to stay." Betsy was thrilled with the praise. Even if I never love him, I'm staying. I promised that I would be married to him until one of us dies. My ma died, Candy said softly. I know she did. I'm so sorry. We had a fight the morning of the day she died. She didn't feel up to getting out of bed, and she'd been sick for a very long time. I wanted her to walk me to school, and when she said she couldn't, I yelled at her and told her she was selfish. Do you think she knows I didn't mean it? Oh, sweetie, of course she knows. And I know she loved you even when you were yelling. That's what mothers do. They love their children unconditionally. You're my new mother. Does that mean you love me? Betsy smiled and nodded. Yes, it does. I choose to love you. But you don't choose to love Pa? I do, but it's different. With romantic love, there's a little bit of something that happens between a man and a woman that's different than between a mother and daughter. Candy nodded. All right. Betsy was relieved her explanation had worked for Candy. She wasn't sure what she would have said next. Oh, I see blackberries. The two of them hurried toward the bush and started picking, each of them using a different basket. I'm surprised they haven't already been picked. They were right along the road. Oh, this is our land. No one will pick our berries. Betsy pointed to the road beside them. There are roads on your land? Of course, Candy said. There need to be roads on a ranch. This is how they get food to the chuck wagon and move the wagon around. The men sleep in a bunkhouse back there too. There are several roads here on the ranch. Seems like you're teaching me as much as I'm teaching you. Candy smiled. I like to be of help, and I love the idea of teaching you. When do we start our piano lessons? We started them last night, didn't we? I guess we did. It's been a long time since I've had someone to play piano with. I always played with my sisters. My mother insisted we all needed to know how to play. Did you like it? Betsy shrugged. I did sometimes, and I didn't at others. I was never fond of practicing, but I'm glad I know how to play now. It will be something we can do together. When do I get to learn to sew? Betsy laughed. You're certainly eager to learn everything. I'll talk to your pa tonight and see if he'd let us go into town and buy some fabric. I know it's a really long drive, but I think it would be nice if you could make one of your own dresses, don't you? I would adore that. And there's a town where we can shop that's only a 15-minute drive from here. Cody is where the train station is, but we don't go there often. Is it where the school and church are? No. They're out in the country. The store is a little further away, but if we felt very adventurous, we could walk there. It would take all day, though. Let's take the wagon then. Betsy loved to go for walks, but that sounded very far. I think we've picked this one dry. Here, let me dump my berries in with yours, and then we still have 2 baskets for the other kinds of berries. Chapter 5. By the time they needed to head home for lunch, Betsy and Candy had 3 full baskets of berries. I'd love to teach you to make pie or jam, but I have a feeling Kirsten will run us out of her kitchen if I try. Candy giggled. I think you're right. We'll just present them to her, and hopefully she'll make one or the other or both, and we'll benefit from her hard work. Great idea. Candy seemed happier and happier by the minute. Betsy had a feeling it had to do with not having to attend school. What do you think we're having for lunch? Betsy asked. You never know with Kirsten. Sometimes she'll make a delicious meal we want to ask her to make over and over, and sometimes she makes something that makes me want to vomit. When that happens, we'll sneak into the kitchen and make something for ourselves. I really like that plan, Candy said. They went inside and put their baskets of berries on the kitchen table. Kirsten looked at them and nodded. Ja. Kirsten carried food into the dining room for their lunch, and Candy looked down at the plate. I think these are a strange sandwich Kristen makes with ham and jam. They're really good, but I like your cheese sandwich better, Candy said. Betsy sat down with Candy, and she prayed for them. Heavenly Father, thank you for this meal before us, and thank you for bringing us together. I think I've found just where I am meant to be, and I thank you for leading me here. In the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Betsy took a bite of the hot sandwich. I never would have put those things together, but this is delicious. Candy nodded. It's my favorite lunch she makes. While they ate, Betsy considered the sewing lessons. Do you know how to hitch up a wagon? She asked Candy. Candy shrugged. Never done it, but it doesn't look particularly hard. I was hoping we could drive into town today to get your fabric, but we should probably wait until your pa is around to hitch it up. Probably. I don't think he'd be very happy if we tried it on our own. Then we'll stay here today. I have some fabric left from some aprons I made myself on the train. We could make you an apron. It would be a good project to start with. Candy nodded. I'd like that. We can probably talk Pa into taking us to the store on Saturday afternoon as well. I don't even know what day it is. I lost track on the train. It's Tuesday. You arrived on Monday. Did you really have to sleep sitting up on the train? I did. I could have chosen a sleeper car, but that seemed needlessly expensive. I would have chosen a sleeper car. Wouldn't it have been nice if you could just crawl into bed and sleep whenever you wanted to? I was about halfway here when I decided if I ever took a trip like that again, I would get a sleeper car. Betsy had thought she could tough it out. If she'd realized her husband was affluent, she'd have done it. Can we start sewing after lunch, since we can't start baking pies? Absolutely. It will have to be ironed after being in my carpet bag the whole way here, but I think you need to learn to iron anyway. Candy nodded. Though that doesn't seem as much fun as sewing. I'm afraid they go hand in hand. You really can't sew without ironing. Betsy grinned at the girl's groan. We'll go upstairs and get it after lunch. Where will we sew? Ma's sewing machine is still in the parlor, I think. Really? I didn't realize you had something so modern. I've used a sewing machine a few times. Mainly when I was volunteering with orphans. All of the ugliest fabrics get donated to orphans, so I would make them the prettiest dresses I could. The orphanage had made her feel like she belonged somewhere, but her mother had become concerned that she spent all of her time there, instead of strolling through town hoping to meet a man. Anything that didn't lend itself to finding a husband her mother said wasn't worth her time. I always watched her sew on it, but she said I needed to wait just a little longer before I was old enough. Am I old enough now? Betsy smiled, nodding. I do believe you are. She probably wanted you to wait until your legs were long enough to reach the treadle. As soon as lunch was over, Betsy went to retrieve her fabric while Candy went to make sure she knew where her mother's sewing machine was. When Betsy joined Candy, the girl was standing beside a sewing machine. How did I miss that? Betsy asked. The machine was facing down, and there was a tablecloth over the table that we had knickknacks on. Candy looked at the fabric in Betsy's hand. Do you have a pattern? Of course, Betsy said. You'll probably want to cut yours a bit smaller than the ones I made. That makes sense. Now we have to iron, right? Candy asked. Yes, that's next. Do you know where the iron and ironing board are? Betsy had no idea where to even begin looking. I think so. I'll go look. Should I bring it in here? No, I think we'll pin everything and cut it out on the table. So we'll just iron right there beside the dining table. Kristen is not going to like that. Betsy laughed. I can't spend all my time being afraid of Kristen. I know she's been here longer than me, but she's supposed to work for me, right? I'm not so sure about that, With a sassy grin, Candy hurried off to get the iron and ironing board. She came back a few minutes later with the ironing board. Kirsten did not look happy when I put the iron on the stove to heat it. Betsy moved close to Candy and whispered, "There are two of us and only one of her. I'm sure we can beat her up." Candy giggled as she set up the ironing board. Betsy showed her how to get the fabric as smooth as they could without the use of the iron. "There. Now we just need the iron," Betsy said. "You get it," Candy said. Betsy stood straight and put her shoulders back. "I'm not afraid." She hurried into the kitchen, smiled at Kirsten, took the iron, and walked serenely back into the dining room with the iron in hand. Candy looked at her and said, "You're so brave." The two of them laughed together as Betsy demonstrated how to iron. After the fabric was wrinkle-free, Betsy took it to the table, and she pinned the apron pattern to it. "I know I said earlier you should make yours smaller than mine, but I really think we're very close to the same size. Let's go ahead and cut it for an adult, and you'll be able to wear it for years to come." Candy nodded. "All right." When Betsy handed her the scissors, Candy's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "I'm positive. If you mess it up, we'll make something else out of it." As she cut, Candy asked a question that Betsy struggled to find the answer for. "Are you going to have babies?" Betsy thought for a moment. "I hope so. I've always wanted a dozen children." "So you want 12 more, or just 10 more?" "Well, you and Tommy are my children now, so just 10 more." "Where do babies come from?" Candy was almost finished cutting when she asked that question. "Did your mother never talk to you about this?" Candy shook her head. "No, she always acted like it was some big secret. My mother did as well. When my oldest sister got married, she explained it to the rest of us, because she said we shouldn't go into marriage unprepared." "Now you'll tell me?" Candy asked eagerly. Uncertain if Marvin wanted Candy to have the information she was asking for or not, Betsy decided to go ahead and tell her. "I think every girl who is getting close to marriage age should know this, and I happen to know many states allow you to marry at 14, though I don't know if this is one of those states." She gave the girl very basic details of how a baby was made, and Candy seemed satisfied with the answer. "Have you and Pa done that yet?" Betsy blushed profusely. "That's not something I'm willing to talk about." "Why not?" "You said it happened for the first time on a girl's wedding night, and you married Pa yesterday." "I'm not going to discuss that with you." Candy pouted a little, but she didn't press any further. Betsy knew she'd have to have a conversation with her at a later time about never asking anyone questions like that. Before the men were home for supper, the apron was finished. Candy pulled it over her head and tied it behind her back. "What do you think?" she asked. "Do I look old enough to be married?" Betsy nodded. "But I don't think a girl should marry until she's at least 18. Candy groaned. "Do me a favor and don't tell Pa that." "If your Pa asks for my opinion on the matter, I will tell him. If he doesn't, I'll keep my opinion to myself. Is that fair?" Candy nodded. "I believe it is." The door opened then, and Tommy and Marvin came in. "Wash up, son. Supper will be on the table in a minute." "What are you wearing?" Marvin asked Candy. "I don't think I want you looking that grown up." He leaned down and kissed Betsy on the cheek. "Is that yours?" Betsy shook her head. "No, she made it today." His eyes widened in surprise. "Well, look at that. Good job, Candy." "Thank you, Papa. We need more fabric, but neither of us know how to hitch up the wagon." Betsy had planned to discuss a trip to the store with Marvin, but Candy obviously wasn't feeling very patient. "Are you going to the store with Betsy?" he asked. Candy nodded. "I need to pick out the fabric for my dress." "Is that what you're going to make next?" "A dress?" he asked. Betsy said she'd teach me. I sewed this on Ma's sewing machine. I'll drive you into town in the morning, he said, glad his daughter was so eager to learn from Betsy. Thank you, Papa. I'm going to go follow my own advice and wash my hands before supper. Kirsten started setting the food on the table then. Betsy wasn't surprised to see a pie on the table, but she couldn't help but wonder which berry had been used. She still wanted to pick some apples, because apple pie was her very favorite dessert. Pie? Marvin asked when he came back into the room. Betsy and I picked 3 types of berries today. We had so much fun, Candy said. Well, I think that's wonderful. I'm glad you got some fresh air, but I'm even happier that I get to eat pie for dessert. After their prayer, Betsy asked, Did you enjoy working with your pa today, Tommy? Tommy shook his head. All I got to do was hold out nails. Pa did all the hammering. And you wanted to hammer? Betsy asked. He nodded. Pa said he wasn't risking either of our fingers by giving me the hammer, which I think is completely unfair. I tell you what, Marvin said, you can go out and milk the cow tonight, and I'll let you do the whole job by yourself. Candy grinned, obviously pleased her brother was going to have to do an extra chore. Don't look so happy, Candy, Marvin said. I'm sending you out to collect eggs. Candy sighed. Yes, Pa. Marvin looked at Betsy. Seems as if you two had a very busy day, he said. Oh, we did, but it was good. We picked the berries before lunch and then we did the sewing this afternoon. We considered trying to hitch up the wagon but decided it wasn't a great idea. No, it wasn't. I'd rather you never hitched the wagon. It's better if you let me or one of my ranch hands do it for you. Anytime you want to go, just let me know, and we'll make it work. Betsy smiled. Thank you. We won't be long tomorrow. Just selecting everything we need for a brand new dress. I need new shoes too, Candy said. I've outgrown these, and they're mostly worn through. Betsy looked at Marvin, letting him make the decision. Then get new shoes. Do you need new shoes, Tommy? Of course, I do. Then you can ride along with us tomorrow, and we'll get you a new pair as well. Marvin looked at Betsy. Do you need new shoes? Betsy smiled. I brought 6 pair. Candy's jaw dropped. You have 6 pairs of shoes? Now I feel like a neglected orphan. Marvin gave Candy his best dad look. You will be happy with 1 or 2 pair. You can start collecting more shoes when your feet are finished growing. That's what you always say, Pa. I think I should be allowed 2 pair. 1 for every day and 1 for church. Doesn't that sound reasonable? I'll think about it, Marvin told her. I want to go through the children's clothes this evening and see if there's anything else we need to add to the list of purchases. I guess I should look through yours as well. No, I'll let you know when I need more of something, he told her. Focus on the children for now. And yourself if you need anything. Betsy shook her head smiling. My mother wouldn't have let me leave Massachusetts without everything she thought I needed. I'm set for a good long while.